All right, so today we're going to be talking specifically about the narrative form of film rather than just film in general. And we're going to be talking about how narrative form tells a story and how they can use audience expectation of characters with goals and relationships, and we can have a sequence of connected events and a conflict to be resolved. So all of this happens because we have to pick up on cues, which will lead to an emotional response later on once we get to like the climax or something big happens. These cues will build upon each other in order to reach that final goal. And once we get to the ending, we have all these expectations that's been built up with the cues, with different things and details that have been said. We can now either end by satisfying all of these, or we can subvert the expectations by creating some other like twist in order to get the audience's attention and be like, no, let the guy die or something like that. All right. And in addition, the ending can also lead to some kind of reinterpretation of the previous scenes where, for example, we had a scene with maybe like a baby, right? And then once we get to the ending, it's revealed the baby's the bad guy. Now we can look back at the baby and with like a different point of view. Like, this isn't just a cute baby. This is like, this guy turned into a mass murderer or something like that. So one important thing about the narrative form is that we always have a cause and we have an effect. And it's the choice of the filmmaker to decide whether to show the cause and hide the effect, or to show the effect and hide the cause, the other way around. So the causality is what will cause the event. And we also have the time, which is whether the time makes sense on the timeline. And we also have the space, where it's like how far things are from each other, where things are positioned around the world. Then we also have parallelism. So parallelism is basically when we've got different things in the show that like are related to each other in some way. So they can be either in the same way or in contrasting ways. So let's say we have like a hero and a villain, but both of them have the same backstory. That's a good use of parallelism in order to create two characters that, based off one choice, manage to take completely different paths. All right, so next let's look at how we can use the story. Let's look at the difference between story and plot. So story is basically just what happens in chronological order. For example, your story could be someone stole the bike, you try to go find the bike, you find it, and then you, steal it back, I guess. But if you want to do instead, the plot is the way that the events are actually organized. So that could be something like, we start off with the bike being stolen back, and you're like, wow, we hate the protagonist. But then we flash back to when the protagonist's bike got stolen, and then we go through the quest of the protagonist looking for the bike and stealing it back. That would be an example of the plot. So the story stays the same, in which the story is still chronological, but the plot itself is like, we organized it so that we would have the ending first and the actual story behind it later. So that's the difference between story and plot. And the filmmaker can build one story, but they have a lot of different ways that they can represent the plot. And the plot is what will make the emotions that the viewer actually feels. All right, so now let's talk about diegetics and non-diegetics. So these are two techniques that we can use or to just create a better film overall. And the diegetics are basically things that interact directly with the characters. So for example, the roads in New York. If the character is like walking through New York, then the roads in New York would be a diegetic. But for example, let's say we have in a coffee shop and we've got like people in the background just drinking coffee. Those would be non-diegetic because, well, it doesn't really interact with the story. They're just there to exist and create that scene feel around the character, just to like sell the scene more. Another example of a non-diegetic would be like the credits reel, because it doesn't interact with the characters. It just gives the credits, and any music that's playing, because there's not actually an orchestra within the scene itself. The whole goal of the music is for the viewer to feel a certain emotion of suspense or of excitement for the viewer, for the character. Now let's look more specifically at the characters themselves. So characters, they create the causes and then they experience the effects. So they make things happen and then they respond to the events themselves as well. And characters all have different traits. So there's a long list of traits here: attitudes, skills, habits, tastes, psychological drives, and other distinguishing qualities. And so characters, these traits will often like clash with each other, and that's what creates the conflicts. So having a lot of unique and deep characters is always really great, because we're able to actually believe that those characters are real. Now, a key thing to note about characters in the movies is that they often show a lot of their like traits more vividly compared to in real life, and that's just because we choose to highlight those specific traits through like what's shown in the camera and what's like in the scenes that are necessary. So, for example, I'm thinking of Arcane. We know that Caitlyn's like a really good shot because early on she's able to shoot really well in that one scene. So it makes a lot of sense that when in the actual combat scenes she has like really good aim and able to like shoot things. Next up we have causal motivation, and this, or casual motivation. And this is basically where you put a cue early on and this just sits there and you're just like, what is the importance of this random object on my screen? And then later on it gets revealed that this random object is actually super important. It's really cool to see any of this like things, because it's like, wow, I didn't expect that to be so important later on, and it creates this mystery early on, and it creates this satisfaction sort of thing and surprise at the end. So next, let's look more specifically at time. So time is how we get to the end product, but we have to like build up all the things that happened before, and it has to be plausible. So when we're showing time passing, we usually will like not show boring things like the daily commute to work or like sleeping. We'll show more important scenes like when they get fired or hired, or maybe there's like a weird interaction on the way to work. So we know that these other things are happening, so they're not necessary. The only show they've seen is that differ from the person's daily habits. In addition, we're also able to manipulate time to show like the same scene twice. And basically the purpose of this is that we're able to remind the viewer of a certain idea, but we're also able to like show additional perspectives. For example, if we rewind and instead of seeing, if we rewind and instead of like seeing the people, we see it from like a different person's perspective. And when we see it from a different person's perspective, we're able to get more information about the same scene, but now we have like additional knowledge. We can also like engage with like flashbacks. It's just important to make sure that the viewer is able to pick up on the cue that it actually is a flashback. So for example, if we look at Avengers Endgame, when they went to different time periods, it would show up these massive like walls of text. It's like, boom, Vormir 2014 or whatever it was. So we know exactly when that's happening, or like what the time is. So we're able to get this like cue to signal us that the time has changed, or like, well, the place that they're going has changed. So the last manipulating time thing that we can talk about is positioning the end of the movie at the beginning and then going back to look at the causes. And the reason this is really effective is because now we have an expectation. We're expecting that ending event to happen because we know it happens, but we just don't know how it gets there, and we don't know when it's going to occur. So let's say there's a movie and the person gets like killed, right? So now when we flash back, we see that the person isn't dead, and now every single turn we're expecting that person to die. We don't know what's going to kill them. So we have this expectation, and we're more vigilant, and we're also like turning what would normally be a dull scene into one where anything could happen at any time. Okay, now on a similar note to time, we can talk about durations of different aspects of the story. So there's 3 types of durations we can talk about. That's the story duration, the plot duration, and the screen duration. So story duration is how long that the actual story will take place over. So for example, if we looked at the Revolutionary War, it'd be like from 1770 to like 1780 or whatever. I'm not a history major, but it'd take place over that like large several year period. But then if we look at the plot duration, let's say we were doing a movie, we only want to show like the major battles. So we could say the plot duration is only maybe a few days at a time because we're only looking at those battles. And if we look at the screen duration, we don't actually want to show the entire battle. We want to show the key moments, so we're cutting it up so that what we actually see on screen only takes about 2 hours. So our story duration will be several years because that's how long the Revolutionary War actually is and how long the story takes place over, from start of the war to the end of the war. And the plot is the things that will happen in between the story that we want to highlight, and those are the ones we're actually going to film. So those are like the one battle that will take 4 days. We're not going to film all the planning. We're only going to film the battle itself. The screen duration, if this is what we're going to show after we edit through all the battles. And so since we're like doing a Hollywood movie or something like that, we're going to publish it. It's going to be like about 2 hours. All right? And the thing is, we can actually use screen duration to expand to expand or contract the plot duration. So let's say that we have a scene, right? And it's just one person chopping the other guy's head off with a sword. But if we can use the screen duration and extend this like 5-second action into a full-on backstory, and that's sort of what happens okay, spoilers incoming, but it's what happens in like Demon Slayer, the new movie. It's like the guys like they're battling, right? But then they go through the entire backstory, and then they go through like all these other like thoughts in their head while they're in the battles, that the actual fight probably lasts maybe like 10 minutes, but the screen time is like a whole hour, right? They're manipulating the screen time duration so that we can really emphasize the key moments of that battle. All right, we're gonna briefly go over space, and space is just where the location, where everything takes place. So there's things that are in the frame and outside the frame that will matter overall. And normally this will like be the location of the plot, but sometimes we'll have spaces that aren't shown but are described by other characters. Like the example that the book uses is that there was a character that was in a concentration camp, and they would describe the concentration camp, and we don't actually get to see it, but we're left there to imagine all the horrors that person experienced at the concentration camp. Next, we're going to look at the opening, development, and climax. So the opening, it just provides the basis. It tells you what the viewer can expect. It tells you backstory about the characters. It'll always suggest something to about the backstory, pretty much, because otherwise you have no reason to care about the character. And our development is where we keep learning new knowledge, and as we go through the story, of course, we'll learn more and more knowledge, but at some point we learn this crucial bit of knowledge, and that's usually where your climax is going to happen. And your climax is the turning point in the story. It's where the big action happens. We finally got to the final boss, we're gonna fight the final boss, that would be your climax. And and finally, once we're done with the climax, we get to the ending. And endings, they satisfy or they subvert the viewer's expectations. So you'll get an ending that solves the issue at the beginning, but sometimes you'll get a control ending. Like if you ever watch Inception, and it ends with the top spinning, you don't get to see whether it falls or stays up. And this is the sort of ending that makes you think, is he really in real life? Is he in a dream? Stuff like that. And the last thing we're going to talk about is restricted and unrestricted story info. So restricted is when we only know as much as one character that we're following, for example. And unrestricted means we have the whole scene. We know more than the average character in the show, because we're swapping between the point of view of the two characters. We're looking at a drone shot of the battle, so we can see where the enemies are, versus the characters are they around this corner? Are they around that corner? And note that restricted and unrestricted isn't two things. It's a spectrum. So we can choose to be super unrestricted. We can choose a little bit of balance in between, where sometimes we'll know as much as a certain character, or alternatively we'll just know everything. Right? It's a spectrum. We can't really restrict it to specifically just one character in all situations. All right. And yeah, based on the restriction and unrestriction, we can have either a very biased view based on if it's restricted to one character, we see it only through that character's point of view, so we'll only think of the aliens as evil, for example. But then if we have an unrestricted view, then we can see the aliens are just trying to survive. If I remember, Captain Marvel has a really good use of this, in which early on we have the point of view restricted to only the only that one society, and that they go kill the other society. But then we get to learn an unrestricted view of how the other aliens actually live life and how they're just trying to find a new home. So yeah, very long rant today. Sorry. All right.